I think we've all heard that David was a man after God's own heart. This is mentioned twice in the Bible, once in Samuel and once in Acts, where Paul quotes it. It's a very famous biblical statement. A few years ago, I learned that a common scholarly explanation of this statement is that when God says he chose David as a man after his own heart, all it really means is that David was the man that God wanted for the job. Not that David's heart or character resembled God's heart and character, but that it's simply an expression, meaning this was God's desire, his choice, his will. This is the man I want. According to my heart and pleasure, I picked David. So I've been thinking about this a few years, and there's a reasonable basis to the view, largely rooted in the fact that David sinned very badly, which obviously severely contradicts God's heart and character. But in thinking about it, I don't think that explanation is right. I think David really was a man after God's own heart. Not that his character was perfect, but that in some fashion, David's heart was like God's. And that God saw that in him, and that's why he chose David as king, as a man after his own heart. So today I want to give you some of the reasons and evidence I think this is so. That David's heart was like God's. And to some degree, they shared a special connection. So point one. God says he chose David after his own heart, and that he looked on David's heart in making his choice. Please turn to 1 Samuel chapter 16. Shortly before this, in chapter 13, is where this famous phrase is first recorded. Through the prophet Samuel, God tells Saul that his dynasty will not endure, and that God has sought a new king, a man after his own heart, in Saul's place. From what I can tell from the Hebrew, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but this is what it looks like to me, the phrase after his own heart appears to literally mean like his heart. You can cross-reference this with Deuteronomy 20, verse 8, where it's translated that way in another context. So in 1 Samuel chapter 16, then, which you've turned to, Samuel goes to the house of Jesse to anoint this new king. You know the story. God hasn't told Samuel who it is yet, so Samuel begins to inspect Jesse's sons. Verse 6. So it was when they came that Samuel looked at Eliab and said, "Surely the Eternal's anointed is before him." But the Eternal said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I refused him. For the Eternal does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Eternal looks at the heart." So this is another very clear and famous statement in the Bible. When judging a man, God doesn't look at outward appearance. He looks at the heart, the person inside, the character and being of the person. And you know the story. After seeing all of Jesse's other sons, it's the youngest, David, that's brought in, and God said, "That's the one. That's the heart I want." So here's my point. I don't think it's a coincidence that God said he had chosen a man after his own heart, which literally means like his heart. And then in choosing that man, God says he looked on that man's heart in making his decision. I think careful readers are supposed to draw the connection between the two hearts. That there's something here that God saw in David's heart that resembled his own. After David's death, God summed up his life this way. He said, "David walked in integrity of heart." The word integrity means in fullness, complete, and blameless. So the fact that God chose a unique phrase, biblically speaking, in saying he chose a man, David, after his own heart, and the fact that God specifically and dramatically states that in choosing David, he examined David's heart, and that God sums up David's later life by saying David walked in integrity of heart, all that suggests strongly to me that God intended for us to see that somehow there was a resemblance or connection between David's heart and his own. I do not think that is a coincidence. Point 2. God projected himself on David. Now, you could talk a long while about how David was a type of Christ. We all know a lot of these things. Because he wasn't just a type of Christ, in the sense that many other people in the Bible are. He was, it seems to me, intensely messianic. Many of the events in David's life and nature foreshadow a lot of what Christ, who is God, later did and still will do. You can even see this from the very beginning of David's story. Here's one example you may not have thought of. God rejected Saul as king for disobedience and pride and took his spirit from him and anointed David the new king of Israel. But God let Saul stay on the throne for a very long time, even after David was anointed the new king, and Saul tried to kill David multiple times. I see in these events Satan sitting on the throne of the earth, then rejected for his pride and disobedience, but not yet removed, like Saul, and Christ, already anointed as king, hated and attacked by Satan when he was on the earth, and still waiting to ultimately return to the earth and take his throne, like David. There are multitudes of other examples, which we won't go through, which show David as a type of Christ, most of which, as I said, I assume you know. David's the great king of Israel. He's the great warrior who defeated enemy nations. He's betrayed by his friend, his good friend, which is kind of a type of Judas portraying Christ. There's a lot of that. But if you really want proof that David was a type of Jesus and intensely messianic, I think you need only look at a couple of the titles Christ took for himself. We know God took the names of the fathers as one of his own names. That's a really important point. He called himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Jesus is also called the Son of David. He chose to be David's literal descendant, of course, but we should also remember that the son of someone in the Bible, and in Hebrew thinking, often means that the son has that person's characteristics. Also, at the end of the Bible, in Revelation 22, the glorified Jesus calls himself the root and offspring of David. That is, he's both David's origin and descendant. But what really strikes me on this point, that God projected himself onto David in typology and in taking these titles and all that, was how personal it could sometimes be. Please turn to Matthew 27, verse 46. Jesus has been crucified here. Matthew 27, verse 46. At about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus here is quoting Psalm 22, which is one of David's many recorded personal prayers. It begins with David praying, my God, why have you forsaken me? The psalm also describes Christ's experience of being beaten and insulted and crucified, all in the first person. This is the psalm where David prays, they pierced my hands and my feet. So think about that for just a second. You know, with typology and symbolism, it's sometimes easy to view it as sort of abstract academic thing, like, oh, he was a type of Christ, here's the parallel, blah, blah, blah. But look at this. This isn't the only place it happens in David's Psalms, but it's the most obvious. God, Jesus Christ, in looking down at David, at guiding his life, put his own words and thoughts and emotions, which he himself would later say and think and feel when he was being crucified, into David. And they first came out as David's personal prayer in the first person, as some events were happening to David himself, so he prayed to God. David was a prophet, but this seems to me to be very different than a prophet coming and saying, "Thus saith the Lord." This is God projecting himself onto David. And I think it strongly suggests a unique connection between the two, because David was a man after God's own heart. Point 3. David's reward is great. Please turn to Jeremiah 30. I think all of us would agree that the essence of Christianity is to build godly character. It's supposed to grow in the measure of the stature of Christ, that's a biblical phrase, and partake of the divine nature. And we teach that our reward in the kingdom depends on how much we've done that. That's right. It's a fundamental biblical teaching. Well, in Jeremiah 30, there's a prophecy about Israel and Judah returning to the promised land in the millennium. Verse 3. For behold, the days are coming, says the Eternal, that I will bring back from captivity my people Israel and Judah, says the Eternal. And I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. So this is the millennium. Verse 8. For it shall come to pass in that day, says the Eternal of hosts, that I will break his yoke from your neck and will burst your bonds. Foreigners shall no more enslave them, but they shall serve the Eternal, their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. Now, some think this is a reference to David, and it's just actually a reference to Christ. I think David means Christ here. But that's not right. This is a resurrected David. I'll quote the UCG Bible Correspondence Course here. Quote, notice again the mention of King David being resurrected. This is repeated in Ezekiel. Some think David in both places is a reference to Christ, David's descendant, since it is Christ who inherits the throne of David to reign as king over Israel. Yet notice that verse 9 says the Israelites will serve the Eternal their God and David their king. The Eternal in this context is Jesus Christ. Christ promises that in his coming kingdom, it goes on, his servants will share his throne with him. Yet they will have specialized administrative duties, being given particular rule under him over different responsibilities, such as different numbers of cities. The 12 apostles, resurrected in glory, will each rule over one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and a resurrected David will serve as king under Christ over all of them. End quote. So David will not only be in the first resurrection, he'll again be king over Israel, and of the 12 apostles below him, just like they were under Christ. And if, as we believe, God's reward in the kingdom to Christians is commensurate with their degree of Christian character, with how much their heart has become like God's heart, then it would seem to me that God felt David's heart was sufficiently Christ-like to give him either the top spot or one of the top spots in the kingdom of God, and certainly the spot most directly analogous to Christ's own. So that's my view. I think when God said David was a man after his own heart, he meant it exactly the way it sounds. That in some way David's heart was like his and it resembled his own. First, because specifically God says he chose David after his heart, and that he specifically looked on David's heart in making his choice. Second, because throughout David's life, God projected himself on David as an intensely messianic figure, even going so far as to take titles like Son of David for himself. And he also put his own thoughts and words and emotions into David's own mind and mouth. So the connection seems very personal. And third, because David's reward in the kingdom of God is very great, and will have a position analogous to Christ as the King of Israel, which proves that, in God's judgment, David's heart was sufficiently Christ-like to warrant it.